Somebody alone in first place tonight. Our first guest is a writer for SB Nation's Mid-Major Madness and The Inlander in Spokane. He is our favorite Zag fan, if there is such a thing. WIll Maupin joins us on the Deseret First Credit Union Hotline. Will, great to have you on BYU Sports Nation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So we want to know how big of a gap exists between BYU and what we like to call in Studio B, St. Zaga, the combo of St. Mary's and Gonzaga.
Well, I love the St. Zaga name, but I think the answer to this question depends on what gap you're asking about. If you're asking about the gap between St. Zaga and BYU in terms of talent, in terms of ability to execute a game plan, and ability to win games, I don't think the gap is very large, especially in league play. These teams are pretty close. They're closer than they've been for a few years because BYU is much better than they were last year. But if you're asking about the gap between them in terms of ability to win the league, I think the gap's almost insurmountable at this point for BYU, since the Cougars have done the two things you can't do if you want to win the league, which is drop a game to a team that isn't St. Zaga and then fail to hold on their home court against one of those two teams.
Will, we call the non-Big Three non-Saint Zaga.
Non-Saint Zaga. Okay,
yeah,
so that's easier.
So just so if we bring that up, that's the verbal guide there. This is a big matchup tonight. Obviously, St. Mary's a tremendous team. They dropped the two games to Washington State and Georgia, but they've been red hot since, one in Provo. Now they go up to Spokane in the big rivalry game. Who do you think comes out on top in this matchup tonight?
Well, I got in a little bit of trouble yesterday because somebody at the Mid-Major Madness Twitter account tweeted out that St. Mary's is going to win. And I had to write the preview of the game for them, and I would not agree with that. I do not think St. Mary's is going to – they're, like you said, they're a really good team. They're rolling right now. They're a great offensive team. They're second in the nation in offensive efficiency behind only Duke. But since the start of conference play, Gonzaga has been posting better offensive efficiency numbers. They've been scoring 1.28 points per possession to St. Mary's 1.22. And on the whole of the season, St. Mary's does rank as the second most efficient offense, but Gonzaga ranks as the fourth most efficient offense in the nation. So St. Mary's calling card is offense, and Gonzaga has that almost matched. And then St. Mary's defense, they don't have Joe Rahan anymore, Defensive Player of the Year last year in the conference. And even with him, they weren't able to contain Gonzaga's guards. And Gonzaga doesn't have quite the same backcourt, but they have some holdovers, and they have brought in some new pieces that are just far more athletic than what St. Mary's has.
Follow him on Twitter at Will's WCC blog. Great stuff. All right, Will. Who will win tonight between St. Mary's and Gonzaga, and why?
Gonzaga, I think, will win, and I don't think it will be quite as close as the game between St. Mary's and BYU in Provo. The students are back. They've been gone for a while. The Kennel Club will be rocking. And like I said, the matchup on offense is very similar. St. Mary's defense is borderline terrible. If a team like Washington State can get hot against them, anybody can. And Gonzaga's been hot against basically everybody except Villanova, which is arguably the number one team in the country. And then I think where this matchup is really separated is in bench play. St. Mary's has some good players coming off the bench. Cullen Neal, high major transfer. But Gonzaga, what they've been doing lately is bringing, around the first TV timeout, Rui Hachimura, the greatest Japanese basketball prospect ever, and Corey Kispert off the bench at pretty much the same time, running the offense through Rui and just obliterating second units. And St. Mary's doesn't have anybody who can hang with Rui Hachimura, period. But there's nobody coming off the bench that's going to be able to slow down Gonzaga. When Gonzaga brings its players off the bench, they're almost at the level of their starting five. And that's something that no one in this league can match.
Our Twitter question today, Will, is which game are you more interested in tonight, LMU at BYU or St. Mary's at Gonzaga? I strongly feel that St. Mary's at Gonzaga is more interesting to me, not just because the matchup is better, but because if St. Mary's happens to lose tonight and then BYU can pull off a road win next Thursday in Moraga, all of a sudden BYU's in the tie for second. Now it's interesting. How do you see the league race shaping up with the top three here?
Well, yeah, I agree with you. St. Mary's Gonzaga is probably going to be the better game, and it's the more important game. The league race, I don't think BYU has a chance to even share the regular season title at this point. But like you said, yeah, they would need to get that win in Moraga. I think Gonzaga is going to win tonight. I don't really see them slipping up outside in those non-St. Zaga. I don't know what you'd call St. BYU. But,
yeah.
St. Brigham.
St. Brigham, there you go. Yeah, so this game, I think for BYU fans, you would want St. Mary's, even though if St. Mary's loses, BYU has a chance to jump into a tie for second. I think you would want St. Mary's to lose here. I think you want these St. Zaga teams to hold serve at home and then hope that BYU can get an upset and mess with the standings that way. You have to hope that something is going to go wrong outside of these games. But yeah, if BYU can get up into second place, then things are going to be a little bit different, and you're going to be looking for a race for second and that easier path to the final than you are really a race for first.
Will Maupin of SB Nation's Mid-Major Madness and the Inlander in Spokane with us on BYU Sports Nation. Will, what would it take for the West Coast Conference to do what seems unfathomable now and become a 3-bid league to the NCAA tournament this year?
Well, I think the league should every year be a 3-bid league. It should be getting 3 teams into the NCAA tournament. St. Mary's doesn't schedule well enough to make that a reality most years. So for it to happen this year at this point, I think BYU would need to win the automatic bid in Vegas. And I think the Cougars would also need to lose every game between them and St. Zaga to that point. Because if they knock off St. Mary's, they'll probably eliminate the Gales from at-large contention because their resume is just terrible. And if you look around college basketball this year, there are teams with bad resumes week in and week out, multiple teams from Power 5 leagues knocking off top 5, top 10, top 25 teams. St. Mary's best win right now is BYU, but there are teams with significantly more losses that are able to say, hey, we beat Michigan State, or we beat Villanova, or we beat Duke. And when it comes to Selection Sunday, you put St. Mary's resume up against those teams with maybe 10, 11 losses. Their wins just don't match up, and I feel like that's going to exclude possibly the Gales, but certainly a lot of very good, very deserving mid-major teams. So I think for the WCC specifically, Gonzaga needs to lose both games to St. Mary's, and then BYU needs to win the automatic berth.
So do you think it could be a 1-bid league? Gonzaga's the only team that gets in, potentially? Is that at stake?
Yeah, I think if BYU were to take down St. Mary's in Moraga and St. Mary's were to fail to get a win over Gonzaga, and then Gonzaga gets the automatic berth, and things keep happening around the nation as they have been, the Gales' resume will be like it was 2 years ago when both St. Mary's and BYU made the NIT, and St. Mary's, I believe, had 29 wins at the end of the season. They had maybe 25, 26 on Selection Sunday, and they missed out because they just didn't have anything. And their 2 losses, they only have 2 right now, and if they only pick up a couple more, their 2 losses right now are going to be worse than losses to Gonzaga or BYU. So they're not in a good position. They're fighting an uphill battle. I think they're in now, but I think there's a very real chance that they play their way out.
Randy Bennett has proven that he can reload with talent, yet this team seems senior-heavy with the big 3 of Jock Landale and Calvin Hermanson and Emmett Narr. Do you think this is the year St. Mary's needs to make a push, get in the tourney, or it might be a year or 2? Could BYU slip into that second spot starting next year?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I'm not very familiar with what the Gales are bringing in next year. You're right. They always do bring in talent, but I thought this was preseason. I agreed with their pick as the number 1 team. I thought this senior-laden team, great offense, would take a step forward, and this would be the best team ever. They haven't. They're just as good as they were last year, basically, and that was good enough to get them into the second round of the NCAA tournament and play close with Arizona. But, yeah, if they don't, this is the year they need to do it, and if they don't, BYU has a chance to really step up next year, especially with everything the Cougars are going to be bringing back. I didn't expect a breakout year from Yoli Childs like he's been having. And Elijah Bryant, hadn't really seen him fully healthy, didn't watch him much at Elon. So I knew he had this in him, but I didn't really know what he had in him because I hadn't seen it. They're all going to be back. Paz, Celius. I mean, this BYU team on paper should be considerably better than St. Mary's next season because of what BYU has and what St. Mary's will be losing.
Will, who is the most underrated team in the West Coast Conference right now?
Right now, it's hard to say Pacific because they've been sort of taking the league by storm lately, but nobody saw this coming really. So I'll go with the Tigers. They're sitting here at 4-2, despite having to play Gonzaga, St. Mary's, and BYU in their first 4 games, which is like the most brutal stretch you can have in this conference. I would have projected they would be 2-4 at this point, but they've gotten an upset win. They took down San Diego, which had been the surprising, most underrated team. And the Tigers, you look back at their non-conference schedule, they're still below 500 at 9-10 on the year, but they have played some people. They played at Stanford, at Wyoming, at Arizona State when Arizona State was undefeated, at Gonzaga already, and then they've also played a Nevada team that's been in and out of the top 25, and UNLV. And I think you're starting to see this team. It has experience. They're taking better care of the ball. They are an underrated, undervalued team for sure. I'll be surprised if they keep this up, but I'm really surprised that they're even in this position.
Will, great stuff, man. We appreciate the time. We know this is a huge day for you in Spokane. I hope they saved you a good seat tonight in the kennel. Tell me you've got a good seat.
Oh, yeah, I've got a good seat. It's a little cramped in the media section, and I'm sure it'll be super cramped with the Gales in town tonight, but it's good.
Right on, man. Hey, let's do it again soon. Thanks so much for the time.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Will Maupin of Mid-Major Madness for joining us on the Deseret First Credit Union Hotline. Big thanks to him. Deseret First, your values, your timeline, your financial future.